Hello, we're going to get started in a moment. I just want to first verify that people can hear me. So if audio is coming through okay, someone could just put a text in that says, yep, sounds good. Great. Confirm the audio is good, so that's great. We'll go ahead and get started. Looks like we got about 11 people or so. Fabulous. I want to thank everyone for coming to Real Software's first webinar. And since this is our first one, please bear with me as we'll be trying out a few things that we haven't done before. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Real Software Developer Evangelist. And for our initial webinar, I'm going to be giving you an introduction to Real Studio. So briefly, what is Real Studio? Well, Real Studio is a cross-platform development tool, probably the easiest one to use out there. It first was introduced in 1998, so it's been around quite a while. In its original release, it was actually a Mac-only development tool, but it shortly added the ability to create Windows applications, and then over time became a Windows IDE as well, so you could actually use it to develop on Windows, and Linux as well. And then most recently in 2010, we added the ability to create web applications. Real Studio is incredibly easy to use. It uses a drag and drop tool for creating your user interfaces. And I'll show you how all this looks in a moment. But essentially, you just drag the controls you want onto your windows or your web pages, lay out everything how you want it to look, and then add source code, and boom, you're done. You get a running application. Not quite that simple, but pretty close. And as far as programming goes, the code you write is all object-oriented, and it is compiled, so it has a little bit of added performance there. And one benefit of being an object-oriented language is it allows you to model real-world concepts nicely, making for much improved and simpler software development process. One of the big things that Real Studio has been able to do, pretty much since its inception, is to create desktop applications. In particular, it can create desktop applications for Microsoft Windows, OS X, and Linux. And I'm going to show you how to create a desktop application. So let me switch here to Real Studio. The first time you run Real Studio, the new project window appears. This is where you choose the type of project you want to create, which dictates the type of application you're going to create. And your choices are desktop, console, or web as the three different type of apps. I'm going to show you desktop momentarily. The other two, console creates command line applications that still also run on the desktop. And web creates web applications that run in a web browser. And actually, I'll show you how to do that after as well. In addition, there are three templates down here that allow you to create custom console applications. And then one thing that people often gloss over is the examples down here. You can expand this and scan through a list of a wide variety of examples that are included with Real Studio that you can expand and open up and run and play around with and look at the source code and, copy code from them into your projects or whatnot. So that's also a great place to get started. So let's go ahead and click Desktop, and then I'm going to pick Choose. And the main Real Studio window appears, what I like to call the workspace. And by default, it takes you to the initial window that's added to the project. But I'm going to close this so that I can give you an overview of the general layout and how Real Studio itself is organized. Every project that you create is going to have this project tab here on the left. This is where everything that you add to your project, be it more windows or classes or modules or even folders to organize things or whatever, always displays here in the project tab. And you can see by default there are, looks like three that show up here. You get your app, which contains general app properties. When I click on each of these things, you'll see over here on the right-hand side, the properties pane appears, and it displays all the properties associated with whatever was clicked on. In the case of the app, some of the useful properties are things like the app name. You could specify the Windows app name, the Linux app name, the Mac app name. Other settings such as version information and what some defaults are and whatnot. In addition, when you create a new desktop project, you also get a window by default because a desktop application without a window isn't terribly useful to most people. So a default window is created for you, and then a menu bar is also created for you. As you look at Real Studio, you can see the toolbar at the top. There's back and forward buttons that allow you to navigate between items as you're working on them. The Run button is used to actually run your project right in the IDE here without having to do a full build or anything. That's good for testing and debugging and whatnot. The Build button allows you to create an actual build of your project, and you can build it for any of the platforms you desire, OS X, Windows, or Linux, and it'll build them all at once. And Bookmarks allows you to save bookmarks to useful parts of your project. Location and search. Location allows you to jump to parts of your project quickly, and search allows you to search through your project for whatever it is you happen to be looking for. And the sub toolbar that appears here under the tab contains specific things that allow you to add to your project. So for example, you can add more windows, add classes to contain processing or other code, add modules similarly, add folders for organization, add containers to create more powerful user interface layouts, add additional menu bars. That's not usually as common. Most applications typically have just a single menu bar. Add toolbars for use on Windows, and add reports. All right, well now you got a brief overview of what the development tool looks like. So now I'm going to walk you through creating a simple desktop application. And this application is going to be a web browser. And we'll just use what we have here. So the first thing we want to do, so we're going to click on App here, and I'm going to give this a name. And actually, since I'm running on OS X now, I really only need to do the OS X name. But I will do all of them. So you can see I've called the app Simple Browser. And this is the name that would appear in the Finder after you've built it. Will appear in the case of OS X on the menu, as you'll see when we actually run this. And is the overall name of the application. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click on window 1, and you'll see that it'll immediately open up into a new tab. And there's the new tab. Now I'll go over a little bit of what we call here the window layout editor. On the left-hand side of the layout editor, and I'll make this a little bigger so you can see that more easily, are all the available controls that you can add to your window. And as you can see, there's quite a few here. I'll scroll down to the bottom. This has common things like buttons, fields, text areas, controls to handle graphics and drawing of pictures, controls for connecting to the database, things like checkboxes, progress controls. Pretty much, if you think of it, it's going to be in this list, tab control. And these are added to the window simply by clicking on them and dragging them over, which I will show you in a moment. The center area is the actual window layout, and it gives you a mock-up of what the window would look like. In here, since I'm running an OS X, it looks a bit like an OS X window. And I will just drag controls onto this window layout, position things, align things how I want, resize things, or whatnot. And it gives you a very good preview of how things are going to look when you run your actual app. On the right-hand side, which I'll also make a little bit bigger, is the property pane. And this shows specific properties, values, or settings for whatever happens to be selected in the layout editor. This could include, like right now, you can see there's little selection handles on the window itself. So the properties that are appearing are the properties for the window. And this includes things like its title. See up here it says untitled, and that is the title property that appears right here. And you can change whether it's resizable and other settings. And since I'm right here, I'm going to change the window title to be Simple Browser. Now, when you think about a web browser, what does it consist of from a user interface standpoint? Well, there's usually a field for you to type a web address or a URL. And usually there's a big area to actually display the web page. So that's at least two controls. I'm going to add a couple more just to make this a little clearer. I'm going to start with a label. And I'm just going to put a label right here. You'll see I dragged it onto the window, and it's selected because it has these selection handles around it. And as I move it around, when I get near the edges, you're going to see the highlight bars appear that tell you when it's kind of about where it needs to be to match the user interface standards for the platform you're on. In this case, I'll stop and say that looks great. I'm going to come over to the text property. I'm going to change it from untitled and make it say web address. And that's going to be that's the label for the field, which is what I'm going to add next. Let me scroll down here, and I want the text field. So I'm going to click and move that over. Then you'll see as I move it around, little lines appear to help me make sure everything is lined up where it should be. I'll make that a little bit bigger. And this is going to be where we're going to have the user type in the address of the web page they want to go to. So one thing I'm going to do, because I'm probably going to have to refer to this in code, is give it a good name. You'll see when I dragged it on here, by default, it just got a very simple name. It was called text field 1. And that's not terribly descriptive. So I'm going to call this, how about web address? Web address text. Actually, no, I'm going to do web address field. There, I like that. One other thing I'm going to add is a button right next to this. So I'm going to drag a push button over here. And this push button is going to be used so that when the user clicks it, our little tiny app is going to figure out what they type for the address and then display the web page for it. So I'm going to line this over here on the right. I'm going to change its name to be show button because this is going to show the web page. And I'm going to change the caption to also say show. And I think I might also check the box here to say that it's the default button. That looks pretty good. I'm going to resize this, use up the space better. So that's looking pretty good. Now to display the web page itself, there actually happens to be a control in here that I can use. And if I scroll up a little bit, it's called HTML Viewer. And I'm going to drag that over and position it nicely to take up the rest of the space. There. I will give it a nice name. Call it Web Page Viewer. So the initial user interface layout is completed. It's got the main areas that we talked about, place for the user to type the address, a button to display it, and then a place to display it. So now I can actually run this project so you can see what it looks like. And it runs quickly, and now it's an actual running application. You can see here in the menu that it used the app name that we typed in of Simple Browser. That's what OS X does. It shows the app name right in the menu. And our window is right here. Label has appeared. The text field is here. I can type stuff in here. But we haven't made the app do anything, so clicking the button doesn't do anything. I can resize the window, but not all the controls are positioning properly. So I'm going to go back and fix a couple things before we add the tiny bit of code we need to actually make this app do something. So I'm going to quit this. It'll dump me back into Real Studio. Well, the first thing I want to tweak is the positioning of the controls. When I was resizing the window, the controls were just staying where they were based on the original size, which doesn't look terribly right. So I'm going to click on this button here, and what I really want it to do is stay attached to the right-hand side of the window as the window changes. So I'm going to lock it to the right, but I'm going to unlock it from the left. That way it stays attached to the right but doesn't change in its size. However, in the web address field, I'm going to lock it to the right and leave it locked to the left. This will allow it to grow to the right as the window resizes. And then even though this window is resizing automatically, I still am going to check the properties here of lock it to the right and lock it to the bottom, so that you can see how that works when we do a test build using the beta Cocoa framework. Let's run this again. So you can see no real difference in how it looks, except when I resize the window, the controls now look a lot nicer. And I mentioned the Cocoa framework before. This app right now is running using the older Mac Carbon framework. But Real Studio can create applications using the new Cocoa framework that is supported by Apple. And to do that, you simply have to go to your project settings, go to Project Build Settings, and we'll change to the Cocoa. It's still in beta, but a fair amount of things are working quite nice with it. And I'll run it now so you can see what the difference is. In this particular minor app, you don't see a whole heck of a lot of difference. The big thing is the resizer widget at the bottom is now gone, and I can resize from any edge of the window. This is a feature of, I believe, OS X Lion that only Cocoa apps can use. So we've got the makings of a cool little web browser, but it doesn't do anything yet. Well, let's add a couple lines of code to do that. But where do you put the code? Well, Real Studio is event-based. When the user interacts with the user interface, this kicks off a series of events. And each of the controls and the window itself has events that are built in, and that is where you can start to put your code to make your application do something. In the case of our simple little application here, the key event, or the key thing that the user does, is they click the show button. They type in an address in the web address field, and then they're going to click the show button. So that kind of describes an event, the action of clicking the show button. And as it turns out, if I double click on the show button itself, it's going to take us to the code editor. And it will have in the code editor all the events for the item I double clicked, in this case the show button, displayed. And you can see the show button has quite a few events available. 90+% of the time, you're probably going to be working with the action event, which is what is called when the button is clicked. And it's actually called action because there's more than one way to essentially click the button, if you will. On Windows, some buttons can be selected using the keyboard. And for touch devices, you would tap on them. So that's why action is the name of the event. And to demonstrate what this does, I'm just going to put a really simple command here, message box. And this command will just display the text that's in quotes here on the screen when the button is clicked. So I'm going to run the project. And you'll see when I click the button, it says hello in a message box, just like I typed. So that's the right place where we need the magic to happen. So we want to get the address that the user typed into the web address field. So I'm going to create a variable called web address. And it's going to be a string because it's going to contain text. In this variable, I want to assign it what the user typed. Now the user's typing in the web address field. And you'll notice as I'm typing, you see these little, it's kind of helping me along. These little dots are appearing, and even before as I was typing, kind of the rest of what I was typing kind of was shown here in gray. So if I press the tab key whenever I see any of those things, it'll autofill it. And when I get to the dots and I press the tab key, it'll give me some autocompletes as to what it thinks I might be trying to type. And the two choices in this case are the variable I just created or the web address field that's on the window. And in this case, I want the web address field that's on the window because that's where the user is typing their information. And what I want on there is a property that's going to contain what they typed. And as it happens, that property is called text. So these two lines of code simply get the text that the user typed into the address, the web address field. Now I want to show that. And that is shown in the web page, which if I remember correctly, I think we called it Web Page Viewer. But luckily, I'm guessing I didn't quite 100% remember, and the autocomplete's helping me along here. And I'll just keep pressing tab until it says, oh yes, I did call it Web Page Viewer. And what I want to do is tell the web page viewer to do something. So I'm going to call a method on it. And in this particular case, the method is called, and you'll see I started typing because I'm pretty sure it started with, it was load something. And in this case, it is load URL. And I pass it the URL. And the URL is a web address. It starts with HTTP. And that, whoops, that's not the right variable. The variable we created is called web address. So I'll type that. And there it is. So these simple 3 lines of code get the text that the user entered. And we can put a comment here to help remind us of that. Get the web address entered by the user. And we can put a comment here to show the web page. Now I can run the application. Everything looks the same, but if I type an actual web page address here, and then click the show button, you'll see the page come up. And as I resize the window, you can actually see the whole page. So there it is, your first desktop application created using Real Studio. But this is all run inside of Real Studio itself. What if you actually want to, share your great new creation with the world? Well, you have to build your application. And I briefly mentioned that earlier. So first thing we're going to want to do is check our build settings. And this is where you can specify which of the desktop platforms you want to actually build for. Now, by default, it has build for the current platform checked, which means it would build for OS X. And I specifically have OS X checked. If I want to also create the Windows and Linux builds, and yes, you can do that from OS X. Unlike some cross-platform tools, Real Studio can create builds for the other platforms from any platform. So if I'm on OS X, I can create my OS X, Windows, and Linux builds right from OS X. If I'm on Windows, I can create my OS X, Windows, and Linux builds right from Windows, and the same from Linux. It's all very easy. So I'm going to click OK here. And then actually, I'm going to save this project. So I'll go to Save. And now I can click the Build button. And you'll see the build screen will come up here and drop down as it's building each one. This is very fast because the application is, frankly, very tiny. But there it is. When it finished, it opened the Finder window that has a folder. And if I open up this folder, you'll see inside of it is a folder for each of the platforms I built. And you'll see if I wanted to check out the Linux one, it would be in there. And I could copy that to a Linux machine to test it out. Same thing for the Windows one. I could copy the Windows stuff over to a Windows machine to test it out. And then here in the middle one is the OS X one, which I can just double click and it runs. So this is a standalone application right now. Works the same as when I ran it from within Real Studio. And you'll notice there I didn't actually click the show button, I just pressed enter because the show button was set as the default button, which is selected by enter on a window. So now that this is a standalone application, you could actually send this to all your friends by doing something as simple as zipping it, for example. If you were clever and had a Mac developer account with Apple, you could tweak a couple of the settings that are inside this file so that Apple would accept it for submission into their Mac App Store. And there are plenty of apps created with Real Studio that are in Apple's Mac App Store. All right, so that's a desktop application. That's pretty cool, and Real Studio has been able to do that for a long time. But now I'm going to show you its web application capabilities. So I'm going to close this project and pick New Project. And this time, I am going to select Web. and click Choose. And like before, I'll close the default web page that comes up just to give you starting right at square one here. And one thing you're going to notice is that the process of creating a web application is going to be very, very similar to the process of creating a desktop application. But there are differences, of course. For example, a desktop application is generally used by just one person at a time. A web application, however, runs on a server, and any number of people can connect to the application using their web browser. So generally speaking, a web application has more than one user at a time accessing it. And that's an important thing to keep in mind when you're designing your application in general. Now, as you look here, the overall layout and everything is exactly the same, but some of the details are different. For example, in the project list, there's still an app. There's not a window anymore, there's a web page. And there's not a menu, there's a session. And the session is important because that is what gives you access to each user that connects to your web application. So as your application is running, you access the session to get settings such as which browser a particular user connected with using your application, whether using Firefox or Chrome or Safari or Internet Explorer. Speaking of which, those are the 4 browsers that are supported by web applications created with Real Studio. And then there's other things you can add to the project. You can add additional web pages. You can add styles, which allow you to customize the look and feel of controls and text on the pages. You can add dialogues, which are kind of little mini prompts that can display in a web page, usually used for selecting information or showing information. Much like the container in desktop applications, a web container allows you to group controls together. And that classes, modules, and folders are all used as ways for you to do your object-oriented programming and organize your project and whatnot. So for our web application, I'm going to create a project that's similar to the web browser as far as layout goes, but it does something different. And this project is going to be a map viewer. The user is going to type in a map location, like Boston, Massachusetts, click a button, and then a map of that will appear using Google Maps. So to get started, I'm going to double-click on the web page. And you'll see again that this looks very similar to how the windows were designed. On the left are your available controls. In the center is the layout. In this particular case, it looks like a web page. And on the right are the properties. I'll make these a little bigger so everything's easier to see. Now, obviously, the list of controls is different because, not every control that is available on the desktop makes sense on the web and vice versa. But these are the controls that are available for you to use in your web applications. And a lot of them are the same, such as buttons and checkboxes and list box and text fields and text areas and that sort of thing. And then web has some additional ones as well, such as the animator, device location, and the map viewer, which is one that we'll be using for this example project. So to get started, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the Windows desktop project, and name my page here. So I have the page selected, as you can tell by the selection handles. So I'm going to change its title to say Map Viewer. And you can see that immediately was reflected up here. And now I'm going to start dragging the controls over that I want. And I'm going to pretty much do this the same, to look pretty much the same as the web browser did. And you can see when I drag it over, it's got selection handles. And I want this to be in the corner. One thing the web layout editor had is these little pencil icons you can click to do some editing right in line. And I want this to be the label for the location. I'll add a text field up here. And again, it's got the same positioning lines that help me make sure everything is right where I want it. And this is going to be the location the user types, so I'm going to call that location field. And then I'm going to add a button over here on the right-hand side. And this is going to also be the button to show the location, so I'll call it Show Button, and I'll change its caption to Show. And then like I did before, I will resize that to use the space more efficiently. Now the last control I want to add is the map viewer itself, and that will use up the rest of the remaining space as I line everything up. And give it a good name. So there, the initial layout is ready. Now I'm going to run this so you can see what happens. When I click the Run button, it's actually going to compile this like it did for a desktop application. And it's going to send it to the default web browser where you'll be able to interact with it. So you can see it ran it. It started up Safari, which is the default browser here on OS X, and displayed the web application. And you can see there's an actual web address up here. This is the local testing address that's going to be used while you're testing your stuff locally and debugging. There's a text field where I could type something. There's a button I can click to show, but we haven't put any code yet, so it's not going to do anything. And then there's the actual map viewer control. And this actually does something, even though we haven't coded up anything. By default, it hooks directly up to Google Maps. And I can click on it and drag the map around. I can use the zoom buttons to zoom in or out, change it to a map, back to satellite. And all that is just built in. You don't have to code to do anything with it. But notice that the map and the controls did not take advantage of all the space that was available in the web browser, much like when the window controls didn't move when we initially resized the window. And this is fixable just like it was on Windows. So I'm going to close this browser window, get back to Real Studio, and I'll stop the debugger so that I can jump back to the editor. And what I want to do here is change the locking, just like before. And again, I want to lock the button to the right, but not to the left. Lock the text field to the right as well. And lock the map viewer to the right and the bottom. And now when I run it, you'll see that the entire area will be used. Much better. Easy to read a map when you get a lot of space. Okay, well, the next thing we need to do is actually write the code so that when the user clicks the show button, it looks at the address and tells the map to display that address or location or whatever it is that it happens to be. And again, web applications, just like their desktop counterparts, are event-based. Each of the web controls has events that you can implement. So I'm going to double-click on the Show button to get to the code editor, and that's going to show me the events that are available to me. And surprise, surprise, the event that we want happens to be called Action, and that is the event that's called when the button is clicked, tapped, or whatever. Now, this has a couple more lines of code that is needed in order to get a location. The first thing, we'll create a variable called location. And this is actually going to be an instance of a class. And the class is called WebMapLocation. And this is a class that's responsible for taking an address and figuring out a location that can then be used by the map. So in order to populate the location with an actual location, I'm going to give it the address that the user typed into the field. So I set the address property of this location that I've just created, and I set it to what the user typed. Again, this is just like how we did it in the desktop. Properties are even named the same. And then the location viewer, you tell it to display the location. So you say, go to location, and you provide it the location that was just created right here. Additionally, you can call another method called add location, and this will drop a little pin on the map so that the user can clearly see where the location is. The first command actually moves the map to that location and kind of centers it on the map, if you will, but doesn't precisely mark where the location is. So that's it. This has 4 lines of code here. And what we want to do now is run the project. And we'll see here that when we run the project, it looks exactly the same as it did before. But we now can type in the field here and maybe see a location. So I'm going to type in Boston, Massachusetts, and then click the Show button. And you'll see the map relocated. Boston is centered, and there's a little pin here that dropped in the middle of where Boston, Massachusetts is. And you could even get more specific and type Fenway Park, Boston, Massachusetts. And it dropped another pin here, and I could take advantage of the little zoom in buttons and let it catch up. And it zooms right in, and well, it found Fenway Road. If you've ever driven in Boston, you know this is actually somewhat accurate because it's hard to find anything there. There's Fenway Park right up here, so it's a little off. And yeah, that looks like Fenway Park. And they must have taken this picture in October because no one's playing baseball. All right, so that's your web application. But it's only running inside of Real Studio right now. For a web application to be truly useful, you actually want to deploy it somewhere. And with Real Studio web applications, you have 2 ways to do that. I'm going to go to the project build settings, and you'll see there's a tab up here for web. And this is where you can specify the type of web project or web application you want to build. And your 2 choices are CGI or standalone. CGI is actually stands for Common Gateway Interface, and that's a technique used for applications to communicate with web servers. In this particular case, you can create your Real Studio web application as a CGI, and it runs on the web server as a process. But the web server handles communication from the web and then interacts with the Real Studio web application using CGI. This is probably the best method to go if you already have an existing web server that's all configured properly. You can just literally build for CGI, FTP your application up to your web server, maybe tweak a couple settings to enable CGI on your web server, and then go right to the URL and your application is available. The other option is standalone, and this creates an application that contains the web server built right into the application. So you don't need another web server. Whereas with CGI, you'd need a web server like something like Apache to actually handle the requests from the web and then route them to your application. The standalone application has all that built into it. So that makes it very easy to deploy because you just have a single application that you can copy up to a server somewhere and run. If I pick standalone, you'll see that I'm allowed to specify the port. And because this is an actual web server, you have to tell it which port to use. That can get a little tricky depending, again, on what your server is. Generally, you want to use port 80 so that people don't have to type the port into the URL. But depending on how your server is configured, port 80 may or may not be available. But standalone does make it very easy to deploy your applications because you just have to copy the application to the server and run it. And then as long as the application is running, people will be able to access your web application. Oh, and just to point out, because Real Studio is a cross-platform tool, so are the web applications. Now, obviously, they're cross-platform in that the users are going to interact with them through the web browser, and it won't matter what platform the web browser is on. But your web application itself is also cross-platform. You can build it for OS X, Windows, or Linux. That means you can run it on whatever you happen to have for a server. Now, in completely different than how it is on the desktop world, most of the web servers that are out there are Linux-based. So you're going to find you're probably going to be building your web applications for Linux. You'll probably find the complete opposite when you're building desktop applications in that there's far fewer people using Linux on the desktop, so you don't tend to build for that as often. But most of the time, Linux is what you're going to build for your web applications. There can be any number of tabs that are up here. And let's see if I open up a couple. You see I can drag them around to reorder things or whatnot. The IDE is really quite flexible in that regard. But I think that is about it for what I want to cover with the two examples. So let me switch back here. Actually, I'm going to save this. Do all this work, might as well save it, right? And this was Map Viewer. So I covered the desktop applications and covered creating web applications. And I want to point out to everyone that we offer a free trial download right at realsoftware.com. So if you have or haven't checked out Real Studio, by all means, head on over there, download a trial, and you can play around with what I showed you today. You can look at the examples. And I will also mention that this webinar is being recorded and will be available separately as well. So if you actually want to go grab it later and maybe follow along more slowly and pause at certain places or whatnot, that option will be available to you. I also want to encourage you to head over to our website and check out our community section, which has all kinds of information about discussion forums, mailing lists, user groups, and all kinds of things where you can talk with other people that use Real Studio. We have a large and wonderful community of people using Real Studio. Some people are hobbyists that aren't professional programmers, and they use Real Studio to supplement their job. Some people are professional programmers and make their living using Real Studio. We get quite a mix of people, and they're all great. And if you want to meet people even more, I will mention that we have a conference in the spring. The 2013 Real Studio Developer Conference is in April of next year, and it is in Orlando, Florida, which is going to be gorgeous in April. Our conference last year, or this year actually, earlier this spring, was in pretty much the same location. We're just a few blocks from downtown Disney. This is a 3-day conference. There's going to be tons of sessions on how to use Real Studio in a variety of ways. Desktop, web. There'll be sneak peeks at new things we're working on. All kinds of fun stuff. You get to meet developers, ask questions. It's fabulous. Everyone has a great time. And now I am open for some Q&A. And how I'm going to try and handle this here is because I'm leaving everyone muted so the audio quality stays as good as possible. If you have a question, just type it into the little chat box in your GoToMeeting window, and I'm going to scan the list here and answer the ones that I can. So I'm just going to head over there now and see what I have here. All right, I see we got a question here from Roadie Software. How do you distribute or package a desktop app or create an installation program? Yes, that's a great question because there's just so many different ways to do it. I actually wrote a blog post about this, so one other place you might want to head over to check out if you have some questions is go to realsoftwareblog.com. And you can search there on the post I wrote on options for packaging applications. But essentially, there's 3 different ways for each of the platforms. On OS X, often installers are not used, so you usually would create maybe a disk image. And there's tools available that can do that, or you can use disk utility to do that. Even on OS X, some people just distribute their apps as zips. But there's also, you can actually create installers using Apple's Package Maker utility. And there's another tool that I use for sometimes that's called Iceberg that creates installers. And they all work great for OS X. And if you're distributing on the Mac App Store, that's more complicated and involves actually you have to use a command line tool to use Package Maker to create the installer that then gets submitted to Apple. A bunch of other steps. That is complicated enough that I don't even think I could cover it all in a 2-hour webinar. But definitely head over to the realsoftwareblog.com and look for that post I wrote, which was sometime in the summer, so I'm guessing May, June timeframe. That is the Mac. Let me see. So on the Windows side for installers, pretty much on Windows, you're going to want an installer. Although you can distribute your Windows app as a zip file, no Windows users, average Windows user is not going to have any idea what to do with that. So a common installer that people like is something called InnoSetup. InnoSetup. INNO Setup. If you Google that, you'll be taken to the website of JRE Software, who's the makers of InnoSetup. And this is a free tool, and it's great. I think we actually use it at Real Software to create the installers for Real Studio. And it allows you to create a nice setup.exe installer that'll copy your application to program files, maybe create start menu shortcuts, desktop shortcuts, pretty much anything you're going to need for Windows. And actually, if you head over to our documentation wiki, which is docs.realsoftware.com, and search for InnoSetup, you'll find that there's a sample script up there as well that'll get you started with using InnoSetup with for your Real Studio applications. And of course, Windows needing an installer for pretty much everything probably has a million different installers you can choose from. I mentioned InnoSetup. There's another good one whose name is escaping me at the moment. Advanced Installer, that's what it is. That has two versions, a free one, which is nice. It's more visual, so you can drag and drop to create your installs. And then another one you can pay for. And there's Install Shield and other ones as well. And on Linux, it's far more complicated. I often just distribute Linux builds as zips, figuring if someone knows how to use Linux, they'll know where to put their apps. There is one tool called Install Jammer that you can search for that will let you create Linux installations. That tends to work on most Linux distributions, and I have used that one in the past, and it works pretty well. Your other alternative is to create actual distribution packages like RPM files or DEB files for Red Hat or Debian or Ubuntu. Setting those up is very complex. I do have on my to-do list the beginnings of a blog post that might be able to explain some of this, but right now that is not yet published. So we have a little bit more time, it looks like. Are there any other questions that people might have about anything else? Let me just scan the list here. All right, we have another question here from Melroy Coleho. Now I feel like those podcasters that try to pronounce people's names from feedback that they get. It's harder than I thought. How do you share resources between projects? Let me switch back to Real Studio here. When you create something in Real Studio, it's generally speaking internal to the project. But if you right-click on it, there's this option here called Make External. And this allows the item to be tagged as an external file on disk. And once it's an external file, you can use that same file in multiple projects. And when you click Make External, you'll see it prompts you for the name and where to save this external file. And that's pretty much it. So if there's any particular things you need to share between projects, you make them as external, and then you drag them into your projects. I think you have to hold down maybe Command and Option when you drag it in, and that drags in as an external. And when you do that, let me just see here if I save it, you can see what the icon changes to. Yeah, you can see the icon got this tiny little hard to see shortcut icon that tells you this is an external thing. So if I then created another project, I could add this window one to it, and then changes made in one would be reflected in the other. I do want to caution you that this is pretty cool. It's a bit of an advanced feature, but you do want to be careful with what you share because you don't want to inadvertently introduce bugs in Project 2 based on changes you made for Project 1 because of dependencies or whatnot. So that is something to keep in mind, but there are times when sharing stuff like this is useful. The other easy way to share things, of course, is to just, copy and paste between the two. So you can just copy a window, go to your other project, and then you can paste it in. All right. Another question here from Rody Software. Are there any differences or gotchas when developing for both OS X and Windows that you are aware of? Oh, yes, there are plenty. I'm aware of too many to count, I think. Differences or gotchas? Well, the big difference or gotcha is just the general user interface considerations. OS X has its own way of making Windows look a certain way, and Windows has particular things. One of the most obvious ones that maybe you've not noticed before, let me see if I bring up something here. For example, take a look at the OK and cancel buttons here on this window. On OS X, OK is on the right and the cancel's on the left. If you were to drop this down on Microsoft Windows, OK would be here on the left and cancel would be on the right. And that's a little gotcha that you may not pay attention to, but I bet Windows users or Mac users, depending on which way you put these buttons on the screen, would notice. And there's ways around simple things like that. Actually, if you look in the examples of Real Studio, there's a project called OK Cancel Control that demonstrates how you can create buttons that'll flip themselves depending on the platform that they're running on. So there's ways to do that. Other ways to handle specific platform things is to use what I'm typing here as conditional constants. So you can type in a block of code like this, and anything between here will only appear when you're compiling for Windows. And if you had different code that only mattered for OS X, you could use that sort of thing. And what sort of stuff would you put in there? They could be things like, where do you want to store your preferences, for example. It really can be anything. It could be, different, button positioning. You may want a button, like I just showed you here. You may use this to reposition your buttons. It could be a wide variety of things. Other important things to keep in mind between OS X and Windows is graphical drawing. Windows does not have full screen buffering like OS X and Linux has, so it can exhibit flicker if you don't take into consideration how you're drawing to the screen, to the window. And this is a common enough question. I actually wrote a blog post about this a month or so ago, again on our blog, that covers a wide variety of techniques you can use to help manage that when you're creating graphical applications between OS X and Windows. Let's see, are we looking on time? Got a few more minutes. Let me just scan the question list. Mike Griffin has, I'm not sure if that's a question or a comment. Let's see. Hi, Mike says he's using some SOAP method stuff that's built into Real Studio, and he wants to make sure we keep load WSDL. Yes, yeah, that's good advice. Good to hear, Mike, that someone's using SOAP. I'm actually a little surprised that SOAP is not as commonly used as it was a few years ago, but yeah, we have no intention of getting rid of any of that stuff. And scanning here, and Mike does have another question here. Is the Real Studio database a good place to store user settings so at startup they don't have to re-enter them? It certainly can be. The Real Studio database is completely SQLite. It's actually SQLite 3. It has our own little name, but it is completely and exactly SQLite 3. So you can actually open it using any SQLite tool. I think you can even open it with the SQLite command lines on OS X. And it is fast, small, and compact. So it can be a great way to store user settings. But depending on what you're storing, it could also be overkill, and it might make more sense to just use the XML document class or even the JSON class to save settings. And then, of course, it depends on the type of application and where you need to save the settings and that sort of thing. For example, if you're actually creating a Mac app that you want to eventually submit to the Mac App Store, you may want to instead use Apple's Cocoa documentation for saving stuff to the preferences folder. I'm not sure the class is offhand, but that's fairly complicated. The other alternative is to just use the application support folder and just put something like a database file in there, and then Apple that'll be allowed under Apple's sandboxing rules, and you'll be able to more simply manage your preferences that way. And another question here: where can you find information about using JSON? And JSON is the JavaScript's object notation for storing data. It's pretty nice, and it works similar to XML as far as communicating data, but it's nice in that it's a little bit more compact. The JSON's pretty standard, so pretty much anything you're going to find is going to work with it. I don't think we have terribly great examples right now on how to use JSON with Real Studio. That will change hopefully early next year, as I have been in the process of rewriting our entire user manual set, or turning it into a set. So our entire user guide has been completely rewritten. It's now 4 books. And the books are fundamentals, user interface, frameworks, and then development. It's going to cover a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here, things like installers or whatnot. And I do have in there a more detailed example of how to use JSON and comparing it with XML. So if you have specific questions, by all means, just email me. And like Mike has mentioned here, you also do want to check the JSON item class in the language reference at docs.railsoftware.com. And of course, you can ask me, or by all means, take advantage of the community and ask a question on the forums or the mailing list as well. All right, I'm going to switch back here to this slide because it looks like we're about out of time. And I want to make sure that everyone has my email address there on the lower left-hand corner, paul@realsoftware.com. If you have any questions or follow-up or anything related to this, by all means, shoot me an email. I'm all ears. Like I said, this has been recorded, and once this is done, I'll be processing that, getting that cleaned up, and that will be available for download. And this isn't the only one. We plan on doing many more of these, probably on a wide variety of topics. So if you, in general, even if you have specific topics or something you might want to know about, hey, shoot me those. I'll add them to the list, and we'll see what we can do. I want to thank everyone for attending. Have a great day.